moved into the house on Maple Street about 2 months ago, and honestly, I'm still trying to figure out why I thought it would be a good idea. It wasn't the house itself. It's actually perfect for me. A small 2-bedroom with a little garden in the back, cozy but not cramped. The kind of place you could lose yourself in. It was cheap too, which I'm sure had something to do with it. But even then, I'd never describe myself as the superstitious type. Not normally. Things started off pretty standard. I unpacked, got my kitchen in order, made the place feel a little more like home. The neighbors are nice enough, quiet, mostly keep to themselves. There's a middle-aged couple next door, the Thorns. Nice people. They've waved hello a couple of times, but we never really talked much beyond pleasantries. That's fine. I like it that way. But recently, it's been different. At first, it was just little things. Like, I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter, and then when I'd come back, they'd be moved. Just a few inches to the left or right, but enough that I'd notice. I'd think, maybe I just misremembered. I'd even tell myself, you're tired, you're overthinking it. Then it escalated. I came home one evening, and the front door was unlocked. I'm sure I locked it before I left. I'm not careless like that. But I didn't think much of it. I chalked it up to a mistake, like I had done before. But then, the light in the living room was on. I don't remember leaving it on. I guess that's the thing about these kinds of things. They seem so trivial at first, so easy to brush off. I could have convinced myself it was all in my head, if not for the bigger, more unsettling things that started happening. It was a Tuesday, about a week ago. I came home after work and went straight to the kitchen to make dinner. I set my phone on the counter, like I always do. But when I went to pick it up again, it was different. The wallpaper was changed. I had a picture of a sunset, something peaceful, but now it was a close-up of a man's face. Not a blurry generic stock photo, but a man I didn't recognize. He had dark eyes, almost hollow, like they were staring directly at me. I remember feeling that chill run down my spine, but I shook it off. Maybe I had accidentally set it as the background while fumbling with my phone, but I didn't. And it wasn't just that. Over the next couple of days, the man's face was there. On my phone, my computer, even on the small mirror in the hallway by the bathroom. A smudge on the glass, too perfect to be a mark of dirt, like someone had deliberately drawn it. I scrubbed it off each time, but somehow it always came back. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I asked the Thorns about it. Maybe there had been some kind of weird prank. They just looked at me like I was crazy. No one's been around here, Mrs. Thorne said with a nervous laugh, glancing quickly at her husband. No one comes up this way much. But their eyes. God, there was something about their eyes. I don't know why I trusted them, but I asked anyway. Do you ever feel like there's something off about this house? They looked at each other for a long moment. Too long. Like they were deciding whether or not to tell me something. Finally, Mr. Thorne cleared his throat and gave a tight, forced smile. Well, it's an old house, honey. These things are bound to happen. Just part of living in a place with history. That night, after I went to bed, I heard scratching. Light at first, like something brushing against the wall, then louder. I tried to ignore it, but it was relentless. It sounded like claws or nails, raking at the drywall. I turned on the light and stood there in my pajamas, staring at the hallway. Empty. Dead silent. But I know what I heard. The next morning, I walked outside to check the backyard. Maybe some animal had gotten into the crawl space again. And that's when I saw it. Just a few feet from the back porch. A single footprint. But it wasn't a normal one. It was small, but the toes were too long, like someone had been walking barefoot with hands. I thought it was a joke at first. Maybe the Thorns had played a prank on me. But no one had been there. No one but me. I called the landlord. I had to. I was desperate. When he picked up, I said, "Look, There's something wrong with this house. I'm hearing things, seeing things. I don't know what's going on, but I need to get out. Can you? He interrupted me with a long, drawn-out sigh. That house has a history, you know, he said, like it was something he was trying to avoid saying. Not something I usually bring up to tenants, but if you've been there long enough, you'll start to notice. You're not the first to hear things. People don't stay there long. It doesn't. Let them leave. The line went dead after that. I tried calling him back. Nothing. And that's when I realized it. The man's face wasn't just on my phone. It was in the window now, too. Every time I looked out, there was a shadow just past the trees standing in the distance watching. I've locked all the doors, all the windows, but it doesn't stop. I can hear those nails again, the scratching, and when I check, the footprint in the backyard is still there. I've tried to leave. I've packed up, walked outside to my car, but every time when I turn to look at the house, there's something new. A face in the window, a figure standing just outside the door, and the man's face. It's there, in every reflection. Staring, waiting. I'm not sure if I'm imagining it anymore. I don't know how to tell what's real and what's not, but I know I'm not alone here, and I don't think I ever will be again. Next story. The second-hand ire. I live alone in a small one-bedroom apartment in the city. I don't mind it. In fact, I like it most days. It's quiet, and it's mine. The walls are thin, but I'm used to the muffled sounds of the world outside. Sometimes I think it's almost comforting. The distant hum of traffic and the soft footsteps of my neighbors. Their lives a faint echo of mine. I work at a bookstore just a few blocks away. Nothing glamorous, but it pays the bills. I'm good at it. Good at recommending books, shelving them, and pretending like I don't notice when customers are being rude. Some days are slower than others, but the routine is familiar, and familiarity is all I need to feel grounded. But lately, I've been feeling off. I didn't know how to describe it at first. A slight tremor in my chest, like a low hum you hear in the background, but can never place. It started small, barely noticeable. Just a nagging thought at the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like I'd heard something. Like someone was standing by my bed, just watching me. But when I opened my eyes, nothing was there. Just the shadows in my room, still and unchanged. I told myself it was nothing, that it was stress. Maybe I wasn't getting enough sleep. But then, the little things started to pile up. Small, subtle things, like my clock. The thing about my clock is that it's a cheap one I picked up at a thrift store. A plastic, battery-powered model with a bright red second hand that ticks loudly, almost too loudly, against the quiet of my room. I'd always hated how loud it was, but it was one of those things you get used to after a while. At least, I thought I had. But one night, I woke up to the sound of it ticking, louder than usual. So loud that it was like the whole room was shaking with each beat. I blinked at the dark room for a moment, confused, until I realized the second hand was moving backwards. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was still half asleep. But no, there it was, slowly creeping counterclockwise around the face of the clock. My heart started to race. I'd never seen anything like it before. I reached out, grabbed the clock off the nightstand and turned it over, checking the batteries, tapping the back to see if something was stuck, but it was fine. Nothing wrong at all. I placed it back on the nightstand, the tick, tick, tick echoing in the silence, and lay there staring at the ceiling. I thought I was just tired. That was it. The stress, the odd sleep schedule, the creeping sense of unease. It was all just my mind playing tricks on me. I tried to shake it off, but the next morning, I noticed something strange again. My phone was on the kitchen counter. I never put my phone on the counter. Ever. I keep it on my nightstand, charging. I always have. I don't know why I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I had moved it there absent-mindedly. Maybe I'd even taken it out of the bedroom for some reason I couldn't remember. But then, something else caught my eye. The screen. It was cracked. I'm not someone who drops my phone. I'm careful. And I know for a fact that I hadn't cracked the screen. Still, I shrugged it off, told myself it was just another weird, explainable thing. But the unease didn't fade. It only deepened. I started to feel like I was being watched, followed almost. Not by anyone in particular, but by something. And the thing is, I couldn't tell if I was imagining it. I'd catch myself glancing at my reflection in windows, mirrors, anything reflective, almost expecting to see something I couldn't explain. My eyes, those dark circles under them, looked hollow, too tired to belong to me. But no one ever said anything. No one seemed to notice. Except for Adam. He works at the bookstore with me, and we talk sometimes. Not much. Just small talk while shelving books or during our coffee breaks. He's nice enough, I guess. Tall, scruffy, a little awkward. But I like him. At least I used to like him. Lately, though, every time we spoke, I felt this strange undercurrent, like he was looking at me in a way that made my skin crawl. He never said anything outright, but I noticed his gaze linger on me just a little too long. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. And the way he spoke to me, it was off. "Hey," he said to me one afternoon, his voice low and a little too warm. "You doing all right? You've been kind of out of it lately, more than usual." I blinked at him, startled. Was it that obvious? Was I really that much of a mess? "I'm fine," I said quickly, but my voice didn't sound convincing, even to me. "You sure?" He didn't seem convinced. He was standing too close to me, his hand resting on a nearby shelf. "You know, I've been meaning to ask you about something. You haven't noticed anything strange, have you? Anything weird?" I felt a chill, a sharp prickling up my spine. I couldn't tell if he was joking or if he was being serious. Either way, I didn't like where this conversation was heading. "No," I said. "Nothing strange. I'm just tired, that's all." His smile faltered for a second, like he was about to say something else, but thought better of it. Instead, he just nodded. "All right," he said quietly, looking at me for another long moment before turning away. That night, after I got home from work, I noticed it again. The clock, the second hand, it was moving backwards again. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it, threw it against the wall, and watched as it shattered into pieces on the floor. I don't know what I thought that would do. I guess I was hoping it would stop the feeling. The thing, whatever it was, that was creeping into my life. But it didn't stop. If anything, it only grew stronger. I started hearing things, voices, murmurs, soft whispers that I couldn't make out. They seemed to come from the walls, from the corners of my apartment, and I couldn't escape them. The worst part was, I wasn't sure if I was hearing them at all. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain that someone was standing in the doorway, just watching me. And when I'd turn, the room would be empty. That's when I started to doubt myself. Was I losing my mind? Had I always been this paranoid? Or was something really wrong? I went to work the next day, but it was no better. Adam was there again, watching me with that strange look in his eyes. He kept asking if I was okay, kept asking if I noticed anything weird. But this time I couldn't even focus on his words. I don't remember exactly when it happened, but at some point I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd looked at the clock. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen the second hand moving at all, but I could still hear it, the ticking, always ticking. Closer now. Next story. The little room. There's a room in my apartment that I've never used. It's small, just off the kitchen, and tucked behind a closed door I don't often think about. The place I live in isn't huge. It's a modest one-bedroom in a building that's probably seen better days. The walls are thin, the floors creak, and the plumbing is temperamental at best, but it's mine. I've gotten used to it. The little room, it's barely bigger than a closet, really, has always been there, but I've never had any reason to use it. I mean, it doesn't have a window. It's dark. There's only a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling that flickers when you flip the switch. It's been like that since I moved in, but I don't mind it. I don't think about it much. It's just a room. I leave the door closed, and that's that. But recently, things have started to feel off. It's nothing obvious, just little shifts and moments where the atmosphere in my apartment seems heavier than usual. I'll be sitting on the couch watching TV, and suddenly I feel it, like something is there, just beyond my vision. I'll look up, but the room is always empty. The shadows seem darker, more pronounced. I tell myself it's just the lighting, maybe the way the sun hits the walls in the afternoon. Nothing to worry about. But then, one morning, I woke up with a strange feeling. I don't know how to explain it, like I'd been dreaming of something I couldn't remember. But it wasn't a dream. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I felt it again. That creeping feeling. I glanced over at the closed door to the little room. It had always been shut, but this time it was slightly ajar, just a crack. I froze. I don't know why, but a knot formed in my stomach. The door hadn't been open when I went to bed the night before. I was sure of it. I stood up, walked over to it, and nudged the door open with my foot. The air in the room was stale, thick, like it had been sealed off for years. The light bulb flickered when I flipped the switch, casting odd shadows on the walls. I couldn't see much in the dim light, just a small space with a faded rug on the floor and some shelves along one wall. Nothing unusual, just some forgotten things that had been left behind by the previous tenant, I assume. But there was a faint smell. Not bad, but old, dusty, like something hadn't been touched in a long time. I stepped inside, my feet hesitant on the old floorboards. I hadn't been in this room since I'd moved in. Not really, I'd never needed to. The air felt thicker in there. My skin prickled. There was something strange about the way the light flickered. I didn't want to be in there anymore. I backed out slowly, closed the door, and went back to my routine. But then it happened again. The door. It was open, just a crack. I stood in the hallway for a moment, staring at it. It was impossible. I had checked it before I went to bed. I always check it. I hadn't even been near it. Something was wrong. I hesitated for a second, but I couldn't stop myself. I pushed the door open wider this time. The room was just as I'd left it. Nothing had changed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in there with me, hidden in the shadows. I stood at the threshold, unsure of what to do. The air felt cold now, like the room was pulling the warmth from my body. There was something else, though. On the floor, in the corner near the shelves, a small crumpled piece of paper. I didn't touch it at first. I wasn't sure I wanted to know what it was, but I couldn't look away. I stepped forward, bent down, and picked it up. The handwriting on the paper was shaky, almost desperate. "Don't open the door." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know who had written it. I didn't know why it was there. But something about it sent a chill through my chest. I stood in that room, holding the paper, unable to shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. I put the note in my pocket and left the room, closing the door behind me. I didn't know what I'd just discovered, but I knew I didn't want to be in that room anymore. For the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I locked the door when I left in the morning, tried not to think about the note or the room, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. I started hearing things, scratching sounds, faint, like something or someone was moving around in there when I wasn't home. Sometimes I'd come back from work and find the door slightly ajar again, just like before. Other times, I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of the flickering light bulb in the little room, the one that seemed to buzz louder than it should. And then it got worse. One morning when I came home after work, I found something strange on the floor in front of the little room. A footprint, just one. A dark, muddy imprint, like someone had stepped in something wet. It was too small to be my own. I didn't know what to think. I thought maybe it was some sick joke. But there was no one else in the building. No one but me. I backed away from the door, but as I turned to walk back to the kitchen, I heard it. The creaking, slow, like footsteps on the old floorboards, coming from inside the room. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to go in there, but I had to. I couldn't leave it like this. With shaking hands, I pushed open the door. The room was empty, silent, except for one thing. On the shelf, sitting in plain view, was a photograph. It was a picture of me, taken from inside the little room. I didn't recognize the person who had taken it. I didn't know how it had gotten there, but I could see myself in the frame, standing in the hallway, just outside the door. My face was blank, my eyes wide open, staring straight into the camera. And in the corner of the photo, almost hidden in the shadow, was the faint outline of a figure. Someone standing just behind me watching. I backed out of the room, slammed the door shut, and I haven't opened it since. The note in my pocket burns against my skin now. I don't know who wrote it. I don't know if they were warning me, or if they were telling me something. But I know this. Something in that little room knows me, knows things about me that I can't explain. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see that figure in the corner of the photograph. I can feel it, watching me, and I don't know how much longer I can keep the door shut. The neighbors. I never really liked the apartment complex I moved into. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't exactly homey either. The walls were thin, the hallways smelled like a mix of old carpet and cheap cleaning products, and the elevator groaned every time it moved. But it was cheap, affordable, really, and I'd just gotten out of a relationship that drained me, So the idea of being on my own, even in a place like this, felt like freedom. I didn't expect much from my neighbors, but I figured I'd at least get along with them. The people in 3B were quiet enough, just an older couple who kept mostly to themselves. The guy in 3A, Jordan, I think his name was nice enough when we crossed paths. We exchanged pleasantries, and he'd smile at me whenever I left for work or came back, which was about the extent of our interactions. It wasn't the kind of building where people knocked on each other's doors for casual chats, but it was fine. Until a few months ago when the new tenants moved into 3C. At first, I thought it was just a couple. I'd occasionally hear the sound of their voices through the walls, muffled, indistinct conversations, but nothing more. I wasn't particularly curious about them. New neighbors are new neighbors, right? They settled in, and life went on. But then, things got strange. It started with the noises. I'd be sitting on my couch, watching TV, when I'd hear faint scratching sounds coming from the wall behind me. At first, I thought it was just the pipes or something. Old buildings make odd sounds all the time, right? But the scratching would always come at odd times in the middle of the night, when everything else was dead silent. And it wasn't like something was rubbing against the wall. It was sharp, like nails dragging across wood. I tried ignoring it. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be. But then there were the voices. At first, they were soft, like the sound of someone talking to themselves in the next room. But then, one night, I woke up to the sound of crying. It was quiet at first, distant, but unmistakable. The kind of low, aching sobs that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I listened, not sure what to do. The crying was coming from 3C, just next door. But there was something wrong about it. The sobs didn't sound real. It was like someone was faking it, like a child throwing a tantrum almost, but hollow. The kind of crying that felt rehearsed, exaggerated. I wanted to go knock on their door, make sure everything was okay. But I didn't. I'm not that kind of person. I just sat there, frozen, listening. The crying went on for what felt like hours. And then, just like that, it stopped. The next day, I saw the couple from 3C in the hallway as I was leaving for work. They smiled at me, the same way everyone smiles when they're trying to seem normal. The man, tall with dark hair and a kind of unremarkable face, said something about the weather. The woman, pale and too thin, smiled at me but didn't say much. They both seemed perfectly normal. But as I passed them, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the hallway, something out of place. A child's doll. It was lying on the floor, face down, near their door. It was a ragged thing, worn down with age, its limbs twisted unnaturally. I didn't know why it was there, but it struck me as odd. Maybe it had fallen from their apartment, or maybe it was just left behind. But something about it felt off, like it had been placed there deliberately. I don't know why I didn't pick it up, move it, or say anything about it. I just walked past. And then came the tapping. It started a few days after the doll. At night, in the dead silence of the building, I began to hear it. Tap, 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 coming from the wall behind my bed. It wasn't the kind of tapping you get from a pipe or a vent. This was rhythmic, deliberate. Slow at first, then faster. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening as it grew louder, more frantic. The strange thing was, I couldn't tell if it was coming from the other side of the wall or if it was inside the apartment with me. It was as if the sound was everywhere, surrounding me, filling the air. That's when I finally decided to confront them. I knocked on their door one evening after work, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't explain. The door opened slowly, and there they were, just the couple. The man smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hi," I said, my voice shaky. I'm your neighbor from 3D. I'm hearing some noises at night, and I just wanted to check if everything was okay on your end. I didn't mean to intrude, but..." The woman spoke then, her voice soft, almost too soft. "Everything's fine," she said. "Thank you for checking on us. We've been having some trouble sleeping." That's all. I nodded, not sure if I believed her. Something in her tone set me on edge, but I smiled and excused myself, heading back to my apartment as quickly as I could. That night, the tapping came again, louder, more insistent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I called the building manager the next morning. I explained the situation, about the noises, the tapping, the crying, and asked if he could have someone check on 3C. But he just seemed confused, like he didn't understand what I was talking about. He said he'd check in with the tenants, but that they hadn't caused any problems before. He didn't seem concerned, but the noises kept coming. And then, one night, I heard something new. The door to 3C was open. I hadn't noticed it at first, but as I passed it on my way back from the laundry room, I saw the faint light flickering inside. I could hear voices. Not normal conversation, but something else. An eerie, low hum that made my skin crawl. I stopped in my tracks, my pulse quickening. The door wasn't completely open, but it was cracked just enough for me to see into their apartment. I took a step closer, trying to peer inside, when I saw it. The little girl's doll. It was sitting on the floor in front of the door, staring at me with its cold, lifeless eyes. The same doll I had seen in the hallway days earlier. And then, as if on cue, the sound stopped. The voices, the humming, the tapping. It all went silent. But the door to 3C opened wider, just a little more. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. I saw the woman standing in the hallway now, her face pale and blank. Her eyes were vacant, empty. And standing beside her, just behind her, in the darkened apartment, was something else. A figure. A shadow, really. A little girl. She stood motionless, her back turned to me, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. Then the girl turned her head, and I saw her face. It wasn't a face at all, just a blank, featureless mask of pale skin, stretched too tight across the bone. Before I could react, the door slammed shut. I never saw the tenants from 3C again. I don't know where they went, but I don't think I want to know. And the noises, they haven't stopped. Every night when the building settles into its quiet rhythm, I hear the tapping again. But now, it's coming from my wall. Next story. The inheritance? It was an old house, the kind you only find on the outskirts of small towns, where the streets narrow and the houses grow further apart. I didn't want it, not at first. But when my uncle died, he left it to me. His lawyer said I was the only one in the family who could appreciate the legacy. And after everything, after losing my job, my apartment, my sense of direction, it seemed like a good enough escape. The house was as unsettling as it was beautiful. It had character, you could say, but it also had that air of something too permanent. The kind of place you feel like you're never really alone, even when no one's around. It wasn't that the house was huge. 2 stories, 4 bedrooms, a kitchen with old appliances that looked like they belonged in a museum. But there was something about the way the rooms were laid out. The narrow hallways, the creaky stairs. Everything felt like it was built for someone who didn't want to be found. Even the doors were thick, heavy, the kind that made a sound when you opened them, like they were resisting your presence. I moved in at the end of summer. It was quiet, too quiet, but I figured I'd get used to it. Small town living. The neighbors were a few houses down and hardly ever came by, and that was fine with me. It gave me space to figure out what to do with my life after everything had fallen apart. But then there were the whispers. At first, I thought I was just imagining things. You know how it is when you're alone in a big empty house. Your mind starts playing tricks on you. It happened late at night, usually when I was trying to fall asleep. Just a soft, unintelligible murmur, like voices from the other side of a wall. But it wasn't constant. It'd come and go in waves, fading out whenever I tried to focus on it. I told myself it was the house settling. Old wood creaks. Right? The pipes are probably old too. It's all natural. Nothing to worry about. But then there was the door in the basement. I never went down there at first. I don't know why. Maybe it was the damp smell, the shadows that seemed to linger in the corners. The basement was unfinished, just concrete walls and a few old pieces of furniture shoved against the far wall. It was the kind of space you don't really want to explore. I found the door one afternoon when I was down there, trying to clean up the place a bit. It was small, tucked away behind a stack of boxes. I don't know how I missed it before. The door was old wood, chipped and scratched. It wasn't locked, but when I turned the handle, it felt wrong, like there was something on the other side pressing against it, resisting my efforts to open it. But it gave way eventually with a creak that echoed down the hall. And that was when I felt it. A sudden coldness. The air was thick, stale. I stepped into the room, and the floor beneath me seemed to hum, a low, vibrating sound that rattled my teeth. It was dark, the only light coming from the flickering bulb overhead. The room was small, barely big enough to fit a chair and a small table, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. In the middle of the room, in the far corner, was a chair, just a single wooden chair, turned slightly toward the door as if waiting for someone. It looked like an old chair, the kind you'd see in a grandmother's house, faded with age and use. And on the chair was a book. It was a thick, leather-bound thing, black with gold edges. The pages were yellowed, the cover cracked with age. There was no title on it, no name, just an old, worn book sitting there, like it belonged to whoever, or whatever, had been using the room before me. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. The air in the room felt too heavy, too wrong. I didn't want to look at it anymore. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me with shaking hands. I didn't want to know what was inside that book, and I definitely didn't want to find out what had been waiting for me in that room. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers were louder now, more distinct. I heard them through the walls, like they were coming from just behind me. Sometimes I thought I could almost make out words, but every time I tried to focus on them, they'd fade away, only to start again moments later. Around 3 in the morning, I got up to get a glass of water. The house was so quiet. Too quiet. I walked down the hallway, past the basement door, and I could swear I heard someone on the other side. Not a voice, but a sound, like the scraping of wood against concrete. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining it. But then, the scraping stopped, and I swear I heard something else. A soft sound. A whisper. It was coming from the basement. The whisper wasn't like the others. It was clear. A woman's voice. "Come down." I couldn't move. I don't know how long I stood there just staring at the door, but I couldn't resist. Something inside me, some strange pull, made me reach for the handle and open it. The air hit me again, cold and thick. My breath came out in quick bursts, as though the house itself was holding it in. I stepped down the stairs, each one creaking under my weight. The basement was darker than I remembered, the shadows deeper. The room with the chair and the book was still there. But now, it felt different. I couldn't explain it, but something had changed. The room felt like it had shifted. The walls seemed closer, the air was heavier, and the chair? It was empty. But the book was still there. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to look at it, but my eyes were drawn to it, to the way the pages shifted, as though there was something inside calling out to me. The whispers seemed louder now, more insistent. I felt the pull again. This time it was overwhelming. I reached for the book, my fingers trembling as I opened it. The pages were filled with strange symbols, written in a language I didn't recognize. It looked like nothing. Like the ink was bleeding into the paper, the letters swirling and changing shape as I stared at them. The room seemed to contract. The air grew thinner, and the whispers rushed in, now louder, more frantic. I backed away, but the room wasn't letting me leave. It was closing in on me, the walls pressing against my chest. My breath was ragged. The book felt heavier in my hands, and I couldn't get rid of it, couldn't tear my eyes away from the pages. And that's when I saw it. In the center of the page, there was a picture. It wasn't a drawing, not really. It was more like a photograph, one that didn't belong. It was of me, sitting in the same chair in the room, but my face was different. It wasn't me. It was an older version of me, someone worn down, tired, and with dark, empty eyes. And above the photo, in the same strange script, it read, "You belong here." I dropped the book, stumbling backward. The room was gone. The walls were too close now. The air was suffocating. I heard the whispers again, and this time, they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from the book. I ran for the stairs, but they felt longer, stretching out before me like the house was stretching itself, keeping me trapped inside. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it behind me. I ran back upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking. I didn't look back, but I can still hear the whispers, late at night, when everything else is quiet. And every time I close my eyes, I see that photograph. And I wonder if it's me, or if it's the next version of me waiting to take my place. Next story. The mirror in the hallway. The hallway in my apartment is narrow, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. But it's the only way to get from the kitchen to the bathroom, and it's lined with doors that lead to each room. Nothing special about it, except for one thing, the mirror. It's a full-length mirror that's been there since I moved in. It's not an antique or anything fancy, just one of those simple, cheap mirrors you can buy at any big box store. The kind that's framed in black wood, sleek and utilitarian. I don't think I ever really noticed it until one day, about a month after I moved in. It was just another evening. I had just come out of the shower and was walking back down the hallway in a towel, heading toward my bedroom. The hallway was dark, as it usually is when the sun goes down, and the only light came from the small lamp in the living room that illuminated the far end of the hallway. But the mirror, it caught my eye. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was the way the light hit it, or how the reflection seemed sharper than usual. But when I looked into it, I saw something odd. A figure. It wasn't me. At least, not entirely. It was a shadow, standing just behind me in the reflection. A tall, thin figure that I couldn't place. It was like someone was standing in the hallway, but when I whipped around, there was no one there. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. I blinked hard, but when I looked back into the mirror, the figure was gone. I chalked it up to exhaustion. Maybe I was seeing things. Just a trick of the light or my tired eyes. I went back to my bedroom and tried to forget about it, but the image lingered in my mind. The next night, I saw it again. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, and the hallway mirror was just beyond the open door. I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection. I turned, expecting to see the same thing. Nothing. But this time it was worse. The figure wasn't standing behind me anymore. It was moving. It was walking toward me. I swear I could see it now. Its outline, thin and elongated, just at the edge of my peripheral vision. It wasn't like a person, though. It had no features, no face, just a silhouette, darker than the shadows around it. The way it moved was unnatural, slow, deliberate, like it was floating. And as it got closer, I felt a sense of cold, like the air itself was chilling, becoming heavier. I dropped my toothbrush. My hand was shaking as I turned away from the mirror, but when I looked back, the hallway was empty. My stomach twisted. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to be in the hallway anymore, but I had to pass it to get to my bedroom. I forced myself to walk past it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My eyes kept flicking toward the mirror, half expecting to see something, but there was nothing, just my reflection, the hallway behind me, the faint glow from the lamp in the living room. I didn't sleep that night. The next few days were uneventful. I didn't see the figure again, and I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or maybe I was just losing it. But every time I walked past that mirror, I couldn't help but glance into it. And every time, there was that little knot of dread, that feeling like I wasn't truly alone in the hallway. Then one afternoon, after work, I came home and went straight to the bathroom. I was tired, running on caffeine and too little sleep. The house was quiet. I didn't even think about the mirror until I caught my reflection in it. Something was different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. But then it hit me. My reflection wasn't quite right. It was too sharp, too clear. The light in the hallway was dim, but the reflection in the mirror was too vivid. I stepped closer, tilting my head slightly, and that's when I saw it. In the reflection, I wasn't standing by the bathroom door like I was in reality. I was standing by the mirror itself, my face inches from the glass. My heart stopped. I spun around. The hallway was empty, but in the mirror, I could still see myself standing there, staring back, with an expression I didn't recognize. My face, my reflection, looked wrong. There was something off about it, something in the eyes, like they weren't mine. It wasn't just a bad angle. No, this was different. I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was like my reflection was waiting for something. like it was frozen. But at the same time, it was moving on its own, pulling me closer. I backed away from the mirror, my chest tight. I turned off the bathroom light and slammed the door shut. For the rest of the night, I stayed in my room, avoiding the hallway, but I couldn't shake the image of the reflection. The eyes in that reflection, those weren't mine, not anymore. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that it was just stress. But every time I passed that mirror, I couldn't stop myself from looking. And every time it got worse. The next time I saw the figure again, it wasn't just in the reflection. It was there, in the hallway, right in front of me. I had just walked out of my bedroom when I saw it. The same tall, shadowy form, standing just beyond the edge of the hallway, watching. It was still featureless, but now it seemed aware. I froze, paralyzed by the fear that gripped me. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My feet were stuck to the floor, my body refusing to obey. It was like something was holding me there, tethered to the spot. Then, in the mirror, I saw it, the reflection of me. But it wasn't me. It was him. The figure wasn't standing in the hallway anymore. He was standing right next to me, his face inches from mine, behind me, and his eyes, those eyes, were locked onto mine. I could see them clearly in the mirror, glowing faintly. I turned. Nothing. I glanced back at the mirror. He was still there. His smile stretched unnaturally wide now, and I could see the emptiness of it. I couldn't tell where his features ended and the shadow began, and the reflection, my reflection, was grinning back at him. I screamed. I turned to run, but as I did, I saw the hallway in front of me. It wasn't the same. It was longer now, darker. The door to my bedroom was farther away than it should have been, and in the mirror, I saw myself standing there, frozen, grinning with that same empty smile. That was the last time I saw it. I left the apartment that night. I didn't bother with the lease, didn't care. I just had to get out of there. The mirror stayed, though. It was still hanging in the hallway when I walked out, the faint glow of the reflection flickering in the dim light. I don't know what it was, or who it was, but I do know one thing. I can never look into a mirror the same way again. Next story. The knocking. I've never been the kind of person to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. I'm a practical guy. Keep my head down, focus on work, and go home. Life's simple. Or at least, it used to be. I was fine with things being predictable. A little dull maybe, but predictable. That was until I moved into the old townhouse on Elm Street. I didn't know much about the place when I first saw it. The listing said it was charming and full of character, which, looking back, should have been my first warning. But it was affordable, and it was close enough to work that I didn't mind the slightly run-down look of the building. The fact that it had been empty for over a year didn't deter me either. It was just a house, right? I remember the first night I spent there clearly. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and dust, the kind that settles into the corners of an empty house. I was tired from moving in, so I didn't think twice when I heard the first knock. It came from the front door. I froze. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe it was the house settling, old wood creaks and groans, right? I went over to the door cautiously and looked through the peephole. No one, just the empty porch. I checked my watch, 9:45 p.m. Who could be knocking at this hour? I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the wind or some random neighbor playing a joke. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and went to bed. But as I settled under the covers, the knocking came again. This time it was louder. Knock, knock, knock. The rhythm was unmistakable. Not a casual knock, but something deliberate. I got up again, walked to the door, and looked out the peephole. Nothing. I opened the door a crack, just enough to peek outside, and saw nothing. The front porch was empty, not even a breeze stirring the fallen leaves. I shook my head. I was just tired. I closed the door, locked it again, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I was still shaken by it. But life had to go on, so I brushed it off. I got dressed, made coffee, and went to work. That night, when I came home, everything seemed fine. The house was quiet. Almost too quiet. But I didn't think much of it. I had a long day ahead, and I needed rest. But then, just as I was about to settle into bed, the knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was much louder than before, as if whoever was on the other side of the door was trying to break it down. I jumped out of bed, heart racing. I rushed to the door and flung it open. Nothing. Just the empty, dimly lit porch. The silence felt almost too thick, like the air itself was holding its breath. My hands shook as I stood there, staring out at the emptiness. That was when I heard it. A voice. Low, almost a whisper, coming from the edge of the porch, where the shadows met the front steps. Let me in. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The voice wasn't coming from anyone I could see, but it was there, clear as day, in my head and in my bones. It was cold, too cold, and the air around me seemed to drop by several degrees. I slammed the door shut. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the next night either. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the knocking in my head, louder and louder, until it was all I could think about. The knocking didn't stop. Every night at the same time, 9:45, 3 knocks, always the same. Knock, knock, knock. I couldn't ignore it anymore. After 2 weeks, I couldn't take it. I went to the landlord and asked about the house's history. Surely there was some explanation. Maybe it had been a joke played on me by the other tenants. Maybe someone had a key and was messing with me. But the landlord's face went pale when I asked. He told me that the house had been empty for a long time, that no one had lived there for at least 5 years. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that there had been a death in the house a while back. Some woman, he said. They hadn't found out much about her. She had been living alone and there were no signs of foul play. It was just strange, he said. The kind of thing people didn't talk about. I didn't know what to make of that. But when I got home, the knocking was waiting for me. That night, I decided I'd had enough. I couldn't stay in the house anymore, not with whatever this was tormenting me. I packed a bag, grabbed my coat, and walked out the door, intent on finding somewhere, anywhere to stay. But when I reached the front steps, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible scraping sound. It was coming from inside the house, from the hallway. I turned back, my heart hammering in my chest. The door was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it like that. I was sure of it. The door was locked. The house was calling to me. I didn't want to go in, but I couldn't leave. Something was pulling me back, pulling me inside. I stepped through the door. The air was even colder than before, a chill that seemed to creep under my skin, settling deep in my bones. The hallway stretched out before me in the dim light, and then I heard it again. The knock. But this time it was louder. Closer. Knock, knock, knock. From somewhere inside the house, from upstairs. I turned, my legs shaking. I moved toward the stairs, my mind screaming at me to turn around, to leave. But I couldn't. The knocking continued, each sound harder, faster, as if something was getting closer. I reached the top of the stairs. The knocking was deafening now, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through my chest. It felt like the house itself was trembling. The knocking came from the very end of the hall, at the door of the last bedroom. The door was cracked open. A sliver of darkness lay beyond it. I hesitated. My heart was racing, but I couldn't stop myself. I walked down the hall, my steps heavy, each one seeming to echo in the silence. I reached for the door handle. My hand was ice cold. Then I heard the voice again. Let me in. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear, as if it was right behind me, breathing down my neck. I flung the door open. The room was empty. Empty except for a small wooden rocking chair in the corner, gently rocking back and forth. The knocking had stopped, but the air was thick with a presence. Something was there, something I couldn't see. The chair stopped rocking. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally turned to leave, I saw something in the mirror by the door. A figure standing just behind me. I couldn't see its face. It was too dark. But I saw the outline of it. Tall, thin, and tall enough to tower over me. The last thing I heard before the lights went out was the voice. This time clear and sharp, as if it were right in my ear. I'm already in. I don't know how I ended up outside again. I don't know if I ever really left the house. But every night at 9:45, I still hear the knocking. I still feel it. Knock, knock, knock. And sometimes if I stand too close to the door, I swear I can hear that voice whispering just beneath the sound. Let me in. Next story. The sound from the attic. I never used to be the paranoid type. Sure, I'd get the occasional weird feeling, like when the wind howls too loudly outside or when a floorboard creaks for no reason. But nothing serious. I just shrugged it off as part of living alone in an old house. It was an inheritance, one of those places you get because no one else wants it, and you end up with it out of obligation. My aunt's old house on Oak Street, the one with the slanted roof and the big oak tree that overshadowed it, casting long crooked shadows in the afternoon. When I moved in, I didn't expect much. It was just me and a few boxes of my things. The house was quiet, as houses tend to be when they're left empty for too long. I spent the first couple of weeks getting the place in shape, cleaning up dust, fixing a few broken things. But there was something about the attic I couldn't ignore. It wasn't big, just a small cramped space with a narrow staircase that curled up to it. A few old, half-empty boxes, some furniture draped in dusty sheets, and cobwebs in the corners. I'd gone up there a couple of times to check on things, but something about the space unsettled me. It was the way the air was always so much colder up there, even in the summer. The feeling of being watched when I stood too long in the dark. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just an attic after all. But every time I'd hear a noise from upstairs, a creak or a thud, my mind would wander back to it. I figured it was just the house settling. Old houses do that. Right? But then came the night I first heard it. I was in bed, already drifting off, when I heard a sound. At first, I thought it was just the house. But then it came again. A soft thump, and then another. I froze listening. The sound was unmistakable. It was coming from the attic. I waited for it to stop, but it didn't. It was rhythmic, slow, like something or someone was pacing up there, back and forth. The footsteps, muffled through the ceiling, made my skin prickle. I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself it was just an animal. Maybe a squirrel had gotten in and was making a mess in the rafters. It was an old house, after all. There were bound to be pests. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. The noise wasn't like the scampering of small feet. It was heavier, more deliberate, a slow, dragging step. I told myself to go to sleep, that I was imagining things. But the noise didn't stop. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and dragged myself out of bed. My heart was hammering in my chest as I made my way to the attic door. My mind was racing. What was it? A raccoon? A bird? I reached the door at the top of the stairs and hesitated, feeling the cold air radiating from behind it. I turned the handle. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The light from my flashlight flickered as I scanned the room. Nothing. Just the old boxes, the worn furniture, and the eerie quiet. No sound, no movement. I was about to turn around and go back downstairs when I heard something else. A whisper. At first, it was so faint I thought I was imagining it. But then, there it was again. Low, almost like a sigh. It seemed to come from the far corner of the attic, where the shadows were thickest. "Help! Me?" The words were faint, but distinct. My blood turned cold. I didn't want to go further into the attic. I didn't want to find out what was making that sound. But my legs wouldn't listen to me. They carried me toward the corner, my hands shaking as I pointed the flashlight into the darkness. My breath was coming too fast now. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. There was nothing there. Nothing but a pile of old furniture and forgotten things. No one was standing in the corner, no shadow looming over me. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. I stood frozen for a moment, and then the whisper came again. This time it was louder. "Help me!" My heart raced and I couldn't breathe. I snapped the flashlight off and bolted down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps as I ran. The attic door slammed shut behind me, and I locked it without even thinking. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, too afraid to move, my mind replaying the whispers over and over again. What was it? What had I heard? The next day, I called a local contractor to come check out the house. I told him it was just for peace of mind, that I was hearing noises I couldn't explain. I didn't mention the whispers, didn't want to sound crazy. When he arrived, I was surprised by how quickly he got to work. He started poking around the attic, inspecting the beams, the insulation, the roof. But when he came down, he had a strange look on his face. "There's something odd up there," he said, scratching his head. "I'm no expert in this kind of thing, but I think you might have a problem with your attic floor. It's not stable." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to hide my unease. He pointed to the ceiling. "There's some kind of indentation, like something heavy is up there, pushing down on the floorboards. But there's nothing up there that should cause that. Just old furniture, right?" I nodded, my stomach churning. "Right." He gave me a concerned look, but he didn't press further. Instead, he mentioned that he'd patch up the floor and left. I thanked him and went back inside, trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. The noises stopped for a while after that. No more thumps, no more whispers. For a few weeks, I convinced myself I'd imagined it all. But then, one evening, a few days before Christmas, it started again. At first, it was just a soft knocking, like someone tapping gently on the walls. But then it grew louder, faster, more urgent. Knock, 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 thump, thump, thump. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hands trembling. I had no choice. I had to see what was happening. I crept up the stairs, past the door to the attic. The knocking was now frantic, almost frantic enough to shake the walls. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I reached for the door. My fingers hovered above the handle. I wanted to turn back, to run, but I didn't. I opened the door. The attic was empty, completely empty. The only sound was the heavy, irregular thumping from beneath the floor. I was about to leave when I saw it. At the far corner of the attic, there was a patch of dark stain on the floorboards. It was new, still wet. The wood was darkened, as though something heavy had been dragged across it, leaving a trail of dirt and grime. And that's when I heard the whisper again. "Help me." I turned around, heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I saw it. The shadow in the corner just behind the beam, a shape that wasn't quite right. It was moving, slowly, as though it were creeping toward me. I backed away, my mind screaming at me to leave, but my legs wouldn't listen. I stumbled backward into the pile of boxes, and as I did, I knocked one over. Something fell out, something that made my blood run cold. A photograph, a black and white picture, old and worn. It was a picture of the house, taken many years ago, and standing in the doorway, in the same spot I'd just been, was a man. His eyes were wide and empty, hollow sockets staring out from the photo. His face was gaunt, twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. But what terrified me the most was what was written on the back in faded ink. "Help me, I'm still here." That's when I ran. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and never went back up there. I still don't know what I saw, but I hear the knocking sometimes when the house is quiet, when the wind is still. Every now and then, I think I hear the whisper too, soft and far away. And I wonder, if I ever stop running, will I finally find out what's really up there? Or will it find me first? Next story. The reflection in the window. I never thought of myself as an anxious person. Sure, I've had the usual worries: work, relationships, life. But I've always been able to shake things off, move on. My friends would joke that I was the most chill person they knew. But that was before I moved into the apartment on Fairview Avenue. It wasn't the kind of place I'd typically choose. It was old, really old, and the walls were thin. I could hear the neighbors talking in their apartments, their footsteps echoing through the floors. But it was cheap, and it was the only thing available within my budget. The first night I walked through the door, the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The windows were grimy, and the floorboards creaked as if they were protesting each step. But it had character, and that was enough for me. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked my things, hung up pictures, and spent evenings watching TV or reading. The view from my window wasn't much, just the backs of other apartment buildings. But I didn't mind. I was alone, and that was how I liked it. But then, on the third night, things changed. I had just finished reading a book and was about to go to bed when I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the lamp in the window. But when I looked again, my heart stopped. There was someone standing outside, not far, maybe 20 feet away, near the corner of the building. A man. He was facing away from me, looking at something in the distance. His figure was just a silhouette against the dim streetlight. I didn't know how long he'd been standing there, but I felt my chest tighten. The street outside was empty. No cars, no pedestrians, just him. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, though I couldn't see his face. I tried to reason with myself. He was probably just another late-night wanderer, or maybe he was waiting for a friend, but I couldn't help it. The longer I stared at him, the more unnerving it became. I turned away from the window, shaking off the unease, and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing the figure standing there, motionless. And I could swear I heard something, a faint tapping sound, like fingers against glass. The next morning, I convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks. But as the days went by, the man in the window came back. Every night, same spot, same time. I began to dread the evening. The moment the sky darkened and the lights flickered on in the apartment across the way. I'd try not to look, but my eyes always wandered toward the window, always searching for that silhouette. It never moved, never blinked. It just stood there, like it was waiting for something. And then, one night, the tapping started again. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper in the stillness of the apartment. I sat up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The sound was unmistakable. It was coming from the window. I approached cautiously, trying to quiet my breath, as if that would make me less noticeable. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I peeked through the curtains. The man was closer, much closer. He wasn't standing near the corner anymore. He was now directly outside my window, standing on the fire escape, staring into the glass. But his face was still hidden in the shadows. His head tilted slightly as if he was studying me, waiting for something. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. His fingers, long, unnaturally thin, drummed against the glass in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Knock, 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 knock. Over and over. I froze. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I scream? But I couldn't tear myself away from the window. I was rooted to the spot, eyes wide, unable to blink, as if doing so would make him vanish. And then I saw it, in the reflection. I hadn't realized until that moment. But the glass wasn't just reflecting the outside world. It was reflecting me too. And there I was, standing in my living room, just as I had been moments before. But something was wrong. In the reflection, my own face looked different. It was distorted, like a funhouse mirror. The corners of my mouth were pulled back too far, my eyes too wide, and my skin had a sickly pallor. But the worst part? My reflection was grinning. A wide, unsettling grin that I wasn't making. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The tapping grew louder. It wasn't just on the window anymore. Now it was coming from the mirror too, on the glass, in my reflection. A rhythmic, maddening tapping, as if I was the one standing on the other side of the glass. And the reflection. It grinned wider. I backed away from the window, but my reflection in the glass didn't move. It stayed there, smiling, while I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The tapping stopped, and then, just as I turned to leave the room, I heard a voice. "Let me in." It was faint at first, barely audible, but then it grew louder, clearer. "Let me in." I spun around, but the window was empty. The fire escape was gone. The street below was silent. Everything was still. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something had followed me inside. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, eyes fixed on the shadows in the corners of my apartment. The silence was suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, that he was still waiting, watching, tapping. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I don't know if the man was real, or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the stress, or maybe the house was just old. Maybe the glass had distorted the reflection. Maybe I'd imagined the tapping, and maybe the voice wasn't real. But as I walked out the door, I caught one last glimpse of the apartment building. And there, in the window of my old apartment, was the figure once again. Except this time he was grinning. And I wasn't in the reflection. I was gone. I don't know what happened to him, or if he was ever really there at all. But I've been staying with friends since that night. And every time I pass by an apartment building, every time I catch a glimpse of a window, I can't help but wonder, who's standing on the other side?